In the dying light of October 1878, 3 veteran trappers navigated the murky waterways of Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin, their pirogue cutting silently through cypress-darkened channels that have remained unchanged since the dawn of time. What began as a routine expedition into the deepest reaches of America's largest river swamp will become a nightmare that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The official records speak only of 2 men returning to civilization, babbling incoherently about something monstrous that stalked them to the labyrinthine wetlands. But the truth, buried in yellowed newspaper clippings, forgotten diary entries, and whispered Cajun folklore, reveals an encounter so terrifying that it challenged everything these hardened frontiersmen believed about the natural world. Tonight, we uncover the chilling testimony of men who came face to face with what the locals called Le Demon de Marais, the swamp demon. The autumn of 1878 found the American frontier in its final throes, with civilization pushing ever deeper into the continent's remaining wild spaces. Yet even as railroads carved through mountains and telegraph lines connected distant cities, there remained places where modernity dared not tread, primordial landscapes that seemed to exist outside the march of progress. Among these was Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin, a vast wetland wilderness spanning over 1.4 million acres of cypress swamps, meandering bayous, and impenetrable marshland. It was into this forbidding realm that 3 experienced trappers, Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, Marcus Red McConnell, and young Pierre Boudreau, ventured on October 15th, seeking the valuable pelts of muskrat, otter, and beaver that commanded high prices in New Orleans markets. These were not green city dwellers playing at wilderness adventure, but seasoned veterans of the swamp who had spent decades reading the subtle signs of wind, water, and wildlife that meant the difference between profit and perdition. Thibodeau, the expedition's leader, was a second-generation Cajun whose grandfather had fled the British deportation of Acadians over a century earlier. His weather-beaten hands bore the scars of countless encounters with snapping turtles and cottonmouth snakes, while his dark eyes held the quiet confidence of a man who had never met a waterway he couldn't navigate. Red McConnell, despite his Irish surname, had lived in Louisiana long enough to speak the local patois fluently and had earned his nickname not from his hair, which had long since turned silver, but from the copper-colored beard that marked him as unmistakably as a brand. Pierre Boudreau represented the new generation of swamp dwellers, barely 21, but already skilled enough with a rifle and trap line to earn the respect of older men. His mother had warned him against this particular expedition, crossing herself and muttering prayers in the French dialect of her ancestors. The old woman claimed to have seen dark omens and behavior of the marsh birds, but Pierre dismissed such superstitions as the fearful imaginings of age. Their destination lay deep within what locals call the dead water, a section of the basin where the current moved so slowly it seemed almost stagnant, creating an otherworldly landscape of mirror-still channels reflecting twisted cypress limbs like skeletal fingers reaching toward an indifferent sky. Few trappers ventured into these remote waters, not from any rational fear of alligators or quicksand, but because of something far more unsettling, a pervasive sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. The journey began normally enough, their flat-bottomed pirogue loaded with traps, supplies, and provisions for a 2-week expedition. They followed familiar waterways at first, passing the occasional fishing camp or moss-gatherer's shack, exchanging greetings in the mixture of French, Spanish, and English that served as a common tongue of the swamplands. But as they penetrated deeper into the basin's heart, signs of human habitation became increasingly rare until they found themselves surrounded by nothing but endless walls of Spanish moss and the hollow eyes of cypress knees jutting from dark water. By the 3rd day, they had established a base camp on a small island, really nothing more than a raised hummock crown with few hardy oaks, from which they could work their trap lines in the surrounding channels. It was here that the first signs of something amiss began to manifest. Their usual evening chorus of frogs and insects fell unnaturally silent, replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against their eardrums like a physical weight. Red McConnell, veteran of countless nights in the wilderness, found himself starting at shadows and checking his rifle more frequently than usual. "There's something wrong with this place," he confided to Thibodeau as they sat around their small campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering light. "The animals know it too. Ain't seen hide nor hair of anything but a few fish, and even they seemed spooked. Thibodeau nodded grimly, his weathered face etched with concern. In all his years working these waters, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the moods of the swamp, sensing the subtle changes in temperature, humidity, and wildlife behavior that preceded storms, floods, or other natural disasters. But this felt different. Not the clean danger of rising water or approaching weather, but something fundamentally wrong, as if the natural order itself had been disturbed. Young Pierre maintained his skepticism, attributing their unease to overactive imaginations and the disorienting effects of the deep swamp's maze-like geography. "You old-timers are letting the ghost stories get to you," he laughed, though his voice carried a forced quality that betrayed his own growing nervousness. Probably just a dry spell affecting the game populations. The history of Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin stretches back through geological epochs, but its human story begins with the indigenous peoples who first learned to navigate its treacherous waters. The Attakapas, whose name meant man-eater in the Choctaw tongue, had inhabited these wetlands for over 1,000 years before European contact, developing a complex understanding of the swamp's rhythms and dangers that would later pass into the folklore of subsequent inhabitants. According to tribal oral traditions collected by ethnographers in the early 1900s, the Attakapas spoke of certain areas within the Great Swamp that were to be avoided at all costs, places where the spirits of the dead were said to walk, and where encounters with supernatural entities had been recorded for generations. These forbidden zones were marked by subtle signs: the absence of birdsong, water that remained perpetually cold even in summer heat, and an intangible sense of malevolence that could drive even the bravest warriors to flee in terror. The arrival of French explorers in the 18th century brought new stories and fresh fears to the region's growing mythology. Catholic missionaries, attempting to convert the native population, documented numerous accounts of what they termed demonic manifestations in their correspondence with church authorities in Quebec and France. Father Antoine Bergier, who established a mission near present-day Morgan City in 1763, wrote extensively about the local belief in a creature called the Loup-Garuda, Marais, a supernatural entity that was neither fully wolf nor fully human, but something far more terrible than either. The natives speak in hushed tones of a beast that walks upright like a man, but possesses the savagery of the wildest predator, Berger wrote in a letter dated September 12, 1764. They claim it appears during times of great disturbance, floods, hurricanes, or other calamities, as if summoned by the chaos itself. Several of my converts have sworn to witnessing this abomination, describing it as impossibly tall, covered in matted fur that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, and possessed of eyes that glow with an inner fire reminiscent of the flames of perdition. The Acadian refugees who arrived following the Great Expulsion of 1755 brought their own supernatural beliefs to the region, creating a unique synthesis of Catholic mysticism, French folklore, and indigenous shamanism that would characterize Cajun culture for generations. These traumatized exiles, having lost everything in their forced removal from Nova Scotia, found in the Louisiana swamps a landscape that seemed to mirror their own spiritual desolation, a place where the normal rules of civilization held no sway, and where ancient powers still held dominion. It was the Acadians who first began using the term Demon de Marais to describe the entity that had terrified the Attakapas for centuries. Unlike the traditional European concept of demons as fallen angels or corrupted spirits, the swamp demon was understood to be something far more primal, a guardian or manifestation of the wetlands themselves, neither inherently evil nor benevolent, but utterly alien to human understanding. The Spanish colonial period, which lasted from 1762 to 1803, added yet another layer to the region's supernatural taxonomy. Spanish military reports from the era contained scattered references to unexplained incidents in the deep swamp, patrols that returned with men missing, and survivors speaking of encounters with creatures that defied rational explanation. Captain Diego Montemayor, commanding the garrison at Baton Rouge, filed a particularly disturbing report in 1787 describing the discovery of a military courier who had been found alive but completely mute, his hair turned white and his eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has gazed into the abyss and found it gazing back. By the time Louisiana became part of the United States in 1803, the legend of the swamp demon had become so deeply embedded in local culture that even Protestant settlers from other states began to acknowledge its presence, if not its supernatural nature. Newspaper accounts from the antebellum period regularly featured stories of mysterious disappearances, unexplained deaths, and bizarre encounters in the Atchafalaya Basin, though editors typically attributed these incidents to natural causes, alligator attacks, drownings, or encounters with escaped slaves or hostile Indians. The Civil War brought fresh trauma to the region as Confederate and Union forces battled for control of the vital waterways that connected the Gulf of Mexico to the American heartland. Military records from both sides contain references to soldiers refusing to patrol certain areas of the swamp, claiming that something far worse than enemy bullets awaited them in those dark waters. General Nathaniel Banks, commanding Union forces in Louisiana, noted in his memoirs that local guides consistently steered military expeditions away from the Deadwater region, offering vague explanations about bad air or difficult terrain that never quite rang true. It was against this backdrop of centuries-old fear and superstition that Thibodeau, McConnell, and Boudreaux found themselves venturing into the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin in October 1878. They carried with them not only their traps and provisions, but also the accumulated weight of generations of whispered warnings and half-remembered stories that have been passed down to the cultural DNA of the swamp-dwelling peoples. As they worked their trap lines during those first few days, checking muskrat sets and beaver snares with the methodical efficiency of experienced professionals, none of them could have imagined that they were about to become the latest chapter in a legend that stretched back to the dawn of human habitation in Louisiana's primordial wetlands. By the fifth day of their expedition, the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over their camp began to manifest in more tangible ways. The morning of October 20th brought with it an unnatural mist that seemed to rise not from the warming waters, as was typical, but from some deeper source, as if the very earth itself was exhaling the accumulated breath of centuries. This fog possessed an unusual quality, thick enough to reduce visibility to mere yards, yet somehow luminescent, as though infused with pale, ghostly light that had no identifiable source. Pierre Boudreaux was the first to notice that their trap lines had been disturbed during the night, not in the chaotic manner typical of scavenging raccoons or opportunistic alligators, but with almost surgical precision that suggested intelligence and purpose. Several traps had been sprung without taking the bait, while others had been moved entirely, relocated to different positions along the waterway with a care that spoke of deliberate intent rather than random animal interference. "Something's been playing with our sets," Pierre reported as he pulled the Pierrot back to camp, his voice carrying an edge of confusion and growing alarm. Not stealing the bait or trying to get at trapped animals, but moving the whole contraptions around like it was studying them. "I found one trap reset in a spot where there's no game sign at all, just sitting there in open water, like someone wanted us to know they'd been messing with our gear." Red McConnell examined the evidence with the methodical attention of a man who had spent decades reading the subtle signs of wildlife behavior. What he found defied every principle of natural history he had learned in 40 years of wilderness experience. The disturbances showed no recognizable paw prints, claw marks, or other physical evidence that might identify the culprit. Instead, there were only strange impressions in the mud, elongated depressions that suggested something large moving on two legs, with a gait far too long to be human, yet too deliberate to be any known animal. More disturbing still were the sounds that began emanating from the surrounding swamp as the day progressed. At first, these manifested as subtle distortions in the normal acoustic landscape, bird calls that seemed to echo from multiple directions simultaneously, the splash of something large moving through water that came from areas where no disturbance could be seen, and an underlying subsonic rumble that seemed to vibrate through the water itself rather than traveling through the air. Thibodeau, whose grandfather had taught him to interpret the voice of the swamp as clearly as written text, found himself increasingly troubled by these auditory anomalies. "The marsh is speaking to us," he told his companions as they huddled around their evening fire, "but it's saying things I don't understand. In all my years out here, I've never heard anything like it." As darkness fell on their fifth night in the deep water, the phenomena escalated beyond mere disturbances and strange sounds into something that challenged the very foundations of their reality. It began with the sensation of being watched, not the casual awareness of wildlife presence that any experienced woodsman develops, but an intense, focused attention that seemed to bore into their consciousness like a physical weight. The feeling was so strong that all three men found themselves compulsively checking over their shoulders, peering into the wall of Spanish moss and cypress shadows that surrounded their small island sanctuary. Yet despite their vigilance, they could identify no source for their unease. No glowing eyes reflecting their firelight, no movement among the trees, no sound that might indicate the presence of a large predator. It was young Pierre who first saw the lights. They appeared as faint phosphorescent glows moving through the water at the edge of their vision. Subtle illuminations that vanished the moment direct attention was focused upon them. Initially, the men attributed the phenomena to bioluminescent organisms or perhaps a reflection of their fire on patches of floating vegetation. But as the lights became more numerous and their movements more purposeful, such rational explanations became increasingly difficult to maintain. The light seemed to circle their camp at a consistent distance, maintaining what appeared to be a deliberate perimeter that suggested territorial behavior rather than random natural occurrence. When Pierre attempted to investigate by paddling toward one of the glows, it immediately retreated, maintaining the same careful distance while somehow conveying a sense of awareness that no mere biological process could possess. "They're intelligent," Red whispered, his normally steady voice trembling with an emotion that might have been awe or terror. "Whatever's making those lights, it knows we're here and it's keeping track of us." The revelation that they were being systematically observed by some unknown entity transformed their expedition from a routine trapping venture into a psychological ordeal that tested the limits of their sanity. Sleep became impossible as the lights continued their patrol throughout the night, sometimes approaching close enough to illuminate the underside of low-hanging branches before retreating back into the safety of darkness. But it was the sounds that truly unnerved them, not the mysterious echoes and subsonic rumblings they had experienced earlier, but something far more disturbing. Sometime after midnight, they began to hear what could only be described as their own voices calling to them from the surrounding swamp. The mimicry was perfect. Pierre's youthful tenor, Red's gravelly baritone, and Thibodeau's distinctive Cajun accent were reproduced with uncanny accuracy. But the words were wrong, forming sentences none of them remembered speaking and conveying messages that filled them with inexplicable dread. "Pierre!" came Thibodeau's voice from somewhere in the darkness beyond their fire. "Pierre, you need to come see this. Come alone." But Thibodeau sat rigid beside the fire, his face pale and his lips sealed in terrified silence. Dawn brought no relief from the psychological torment that had plagued the three trappers throughout their sleepless night. If anything, the arrival of daylight seemed to intensify the malevolent presence that had taken up residence in the waters surrounding their camp. The morning mist, which should have dissipated with the rising sun, instead grew thicker and more oppressive, taking on an almost solid quality that muffled sound and distorted vision in ways that defied meteorological explanation. It was during their morning meal, a somber affair conducted in near silence, that they discovered the first physical evidence of their nocturnal visitor. Pressed deep into the muddy shore of their island were footprints unlike anything in their collective experience of swamp wildlife. The impressions measured nearly 18 inches in length and showed clear evidence of having been made by something bipedal. Yet the proportions were all wrong for human origin. The prints displayed an elongated heel and what appeared to be webbed toes, but with claw marks extending several inches beyond the digit impressions. Most disturbing of all was the depth of the tracks, pressed so deeply into the riverbank that whatever it made them must have possessed enormous weight and strength. Red McConnell, who had served as an Army scout during the Indian Wars and prided himself on his tracking abilities, found himself completely unable to classify the creature that had left these marks. "It's like someone took a bear's paw and stretched out like taffy," he muttered, kneeling beside the clearest print and comparing it to the span of his own weathered hand. "But bears don't walk upright for any distance, and they sure as hell don't have webbing between their toes like some kind of giant duck." Pierre Boudreau, despite his earlier skepticism regarding local superstitions, found his rational worldview crumbling in the face of accumulating evidence that something genuinely supernatural was stalking them through the labyrinthine waterways. His Catholic upbringing had taught him to believe in the existence of evil, but he had always imagined it in abstract terms: the corruption of human souls or the temptation of sin. The possibility that malevolent entities might possess physical form and inhabit specific geographical locations had never seriously occurred to him until now. Thibodeau, drawing upon generations of accumulated folklore and family wisdom, recognized the signs for what they were: manifestations of the legendary swamp demon that had terrorized the indigenous peoples and early settlers for centuries. But recognition brought no comfort. Only the grim realization that they had ventured into territory where the normal rules of human existence held no sway. The entity's psychological warfare intensified throughout the day, employing tactics that seemed designed to drive them toward some form of mental breakdown. The voice mimicry became more sophisticated and personal, incorporating private conversations and intimate details that no outside observer could possibly have known. When the creature spoke in Red's voice, it referenced his dead wife Mary and their stillborn child, tragedies that the grizzled trapper had never shared with his current companions. "She's waiting for you in the deep water, Red," came his own voice from the surrounding mist. "Mary and little Timothy are waiting for you to join them. All you have to do is walk into the water and let it take you home." The psychological assault proved especially effective because of its intimate nature. Rather than employing generic threats or random terror tactics, the entity demonstrated detailed knowledge of each man's deepest fears and most private sorrows, using this information to craft personalized torments that struck at the very core of their identities. For Pierre, the creature exploited his guilt over defying his mother's warnings and his fear of dying young, without having made his mark on the world. It spoke in his own voice about the disappointment he would cause his family and the waste of his unrealized potential, while simultaneously offering visions of glory and success that could be as if he simply surrendered to its influence. But it was Thibodeau who suffered the most sophisticated psychological attack. The entity seemed to understand his deep connection to the swampland and his role as the inheritor of centuries of Cajun wisdom and tradition. It spoke to him in the voices of his ancestors, his grandfather's distinctive patois, his father's gentle corrections, his grandmother's lullabies, weaving a complex narrative about his duty to feed the ancient hunger that dwelt in the deep water. As the day progressed and the psychological pressure intensified, the three men found themselves beginning to turn against each other. Sleep deprivation, constant fear, and the relentless mental assault began to erode the bonds of trust and companionship that had sustained them through years of dangerous work in the wilderness. Pierre accused Red of planning to abandon them and flee back to civilization, while Red suspected Thibodeau of having led them deliberately into a trap. Thibodeau, for his part, began to wonder if one of his companions might already be under the entity's influence, serving as its agent within their small group. The creature seemed to feed on this growing discord, its attacks becoming bolder and more direct as their unity crumbled. Objects began moving around their camp with no visible cause. Their rifles would be found relocated to different positions. Their supply packs would be opened and rearranged, and their carefully maintained fire would sometimes dim to barely glowing embers despite having been recently stoked with fresh wood. By evening of their sixth day in the deep water, the situation had deteriorated to the point where basic survival began to take precedence over their original trapping mission. Their trap lines lay forgotten and unattended as they focused entirely on maintaining their sanity and defending their small island sanctuary against an enemy that seemed to exist partially outside the normal constraints of physical reality. It was during this nadir of despair and confusion that the swamp demon finally revealed itself in all its terrifying glory. The entity chose to manifest during the darkest hour before dawn on October 22nd, 1878, a moment when the three exhausted trappers had finally succumbed to micro-sleep despite their desperate attempts to maintain vigilance. Pierre Boudreau was the first to awaken, jolted from unconsciousness by a sensation he would later describe as the feeling of ice water being poured directly into my soul. What he saw emerging from the mist-shrouded water defied every category his mind possessed for classifying living creatures. The entity stood approximately 8 feet tall, with proportions that suggested both reptilian and mammalian characteristics fused into something that belonged to neither classification. Its torso was humanoid in basic structure, but covered in what appeared to be a combination of matted fur and scaled skin that shifted and changed texture as Pierre watched in horrified fascination. The creature's head was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of its anatomy, elongated like a crocodilian snout, yet possessing distinctly mammalian features around the eyes and ears. Its jaw was filled with teeth that seemed to belong to multiple different species. Some pointed like a carnivore's canines, others flat like an herbivore's molars, and still others curved like serpentine fangs. But it was the eyes that conveyed the true horror of the encounter. Ancient, intelligent, and filled with malevolence that spoke of consciousness stretching back through geological epochs. The swamp demon moved with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore the normal constraint of physics, gliding across the water's surface without creating ripples and traversing the muddy shoreline without leaving tracks. Its limbs were disproportionately long, with hands that bore webbed fingers ending in claws capable of rending flesh or crushing bone with equal ease. Pierre's paralyzed scream finally escaped his throat, awakening his companions and drawing the entity's full attention to their small camp. When those terrible eyes focused upon him, Pierre felt his sanity begin to fracture under the weight of contact with something so fundamentally alien that his human mind simply lacked the capacity to process its existence. Red McConnell, veteran of combat in countless dangerous encounters, found his hand moving toward his rifle with the automatic reflexes of a lifetime spent in dangerous situations. But as his fingers closed around the weapon stock, the creature's gaze shifted to him, and he felt his muscles lock into rigid immobility. The paralysis was complete and absolute, not the temporary freezing of shock or fear, but something that seemed to reach into his nervous system and sever the connections between thought and action. Thibodeau, drawing upon the accumulated wisdom of generations of swamp dwellers, recognized that they were facing something beyond the scope of conventional resistance. His grandfather's stories had spoken of encounters with the swamp demon that ended in death for those who tried to fight it and madness for those who tried to flee. But there was a third option mentioned in the oldest tales: acknowledgement and negotiation. Nous reconnaissons votre territoire, he whispered in the ancient French dialect his grandmother had taught him, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own racing heartbeat. We acknowledge your territory. We meant no trespass, ancient one. We seek only passage through your domain. The creature's head tilted with predatory curiosity, and for a moment its terrible gaze shifted from Red to focus entirely upon Thibodeau. When it spoke, its voice was a harmonious blend of all the sounds they had heard over the previous days: the subsonic rumbles, the perfect mimicry of human speech, and underlying tones that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly within their bones. You speak the old words, it said, each syllable pronounced with careful precision despite the creature's anatomical impossibilities. Your bloodline remembers what others have forgotten, but memory alone does not grant safe passage through waters that have run red with the offerings of centuries. The revelation that the entity was capable of rational communication paradoxically made the encounter even more terrifying. A mindless predator could be understood, feared, and potentially evaded through superior intelligence or preparation. But this creature possessed an intellect that might well exceed their own, combined with physical capabilities that rendered human advantages meaningless. Pierre, still locked in his paralytic trance, found his consciousness expanding in ways that filled him with existential terror. The creature's presence seemed to create a bubble of altered reality around their camp, within which the normal laws of physics became merely suggestions rather than absolute constraints. He could perceive the entity's thoughts as a vast, alien landscape of concepts and memories that stretched back to millennia of existence in the deep water. Through this unwanted psychic connection, Pierre glimpsed fragments of the creature's history, images of prehistoric swamplands populated by creatures long extinct, memories of indigenous shamans who had sought a bargain with the entity for protection or power, and most disturbing of all, the accumulated suffering of countless victims who had ventured too deeply into waters that belonged to something far older than human civilization. The swamp demon's bargain, when it finally articulated its terms, was as ancient as it was horrifying. It would allow two of them to leave the deep water and return to the world of human civilization, but one must remain as payment for their trespass. The choice of who would stay and who would go was theirs to make, but the decision had to be unanimous. Any attempt at deception or escape would result in all three being claimed as the swamp's eternal prisoners. Choose wisely, the creature intoned, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to originate from the water itself rather than any vocal apparatus. Dawn approaches, and with the rising sun my offer expires. Feed the ancient hunger willingly, or join the countless souls who thought themselves clever enough to cheat death in waters older than your species. The ultimatum presented by the swamp demon created a psychological crucible that tested the bonds of friendship and survival instinct in ways that no civilized man should ever be forced to endure. As the entity retreated into the mist to allow them time for deliberation, the three trappers found themselves confronting a decision that would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives, assuming any of them lived to see another sunrise. Pierre Boudreau, his youth and inexperience making him perhaps more adaptable to impossible circumstances, was the first to regain his voice after the creature's withdrawal. "We could try to fight it," he whispered, though his words carried no conviction. 3 armed men with modern rifles should count for something, even against whatever that thing is. Red McConnell, his weathered face etched with the grim wisdom of a man who had faced death many times before, shook his head slowly. "Did you see how it moved, boy? That thing doesn't follow the same rules we do. Bullets might slow it down, but I don't think they'd stop it. And even if we could kill it, what's to say there aren't more of them out there in the deep water?" Thibodeau remained silent for long minutes, his mind racing through the accumulated folklore and traditional wisdom that had been passed down through generations of his family. The story spoke of others who had faced similar bargains with the ancient entities that dwelt in Louisiana's primordial wetlands. Some had chosen to sacrifice one of their number and lived to tell the tale, while others had attempted to fight or flee and vanish without a trace. "My grandfather told me about a trapping party that came through here back in '42, Thibodeau finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of inherited knowledge. 5 men went in, 2 came out. The survivors claimed they'd been attacked by alligators, but my grandfather knew the signs. He said they had the look of men who'd made a devil's bargain and lived to regret it. The moral implications of their situation created a psychological torture that was almost as effective as the creature's earlier tactics. Each man found himself calculating his own value against that of his companions, weighing factors of age, family obligations, and potential contributions to society in ways that felt like blasphemy against everything they had been taught about human worth and dignity. Pierre, barely 21 and unmarried, argued with desperate logic that his sacrifice would cause the least disruption to existing family structures. Red countered that his advancing age and lack of close relatives made him the natural choice, while Thibodeau pointed out that his deep knowledge of the swamp's geography and dangers made him potentially invaluable for guiding the survivors to safety. But beneath these rational arguments lay deeper currents of fear, guilt, and desperate self-preservation that transformed their friendship into something ugly and desperate. The swamp demon's bargain had not only forced them to choose who would die, but had corrupted the very basis of their relationship by introducing the poison of calculated betrayal into bonds that had previously been founded on mutual trust and respect. As the night wore on and dawn approached with inexorable certainty, their discussion became increasingly frantic and irrational. At various points, each man found himself seriously contemplating murder as a solution to their dilemma. Not the clean sacrifice demanded by the entity, but the treacherous elimination of companions who might otherwise be chosen as the designated victim. It was Red McConnell who finally broke the psychological deadlock with a proposal that was both pragmatic and profoundly selfless. "We're tearing ourselves apart trying to decide who's worth more and who's worth less," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made peace with mortality. "But that's not the real question here. The real question is who has the best chance of getting word back to civilization about what we've encountered." His logic was unassailable, even if its implications were devastating. Pierre's youth and physical condition made him the most likely to survive the difficult journey back through the maze of waterways. Thibodeau's knowledge of the swamp's geography was essential for navigation, and his family connections in the Cajun community would lend credibility to any account of their experiences. Red himself, while tough and experienced, was approaching 60 and had no living relatives who would miss him or carry on his story. "I've had my time on this earth," Red continued, his voice growing stronger as he embraced his decision. "Seen the frontier disappear, watched the old ways die out, bury more friends than any man should have to. Maybe it's fitting that I should stay here with something that's older than all the changes I've witnessed." The nobility of Red's sacrifice was undermined by the terrible realization that accepting his offer would make Pierre and Thibodeau complicit in his murder, not through direct action, but through the calculated abandonment of a friend to a fate worse than death. Yet the alternative was a potential doom of all 3, which would serve no purpose beyond satisfying their own moral squeamishness. As the first pale light of dawn began to penetrate the perpetual mist that shrouded their camp, the swamp demon materialized once again from the dark water. Its ancient eyes surveyed the three men with an expression that might have been amusement or contempt, as if it had witnessed the same scenario play out countless times over the centuries with minor variations in the details but identical conclusions. "Have you chosen?" the creature asked, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the water itself. Red McConnell stepped forward before his companions could speak, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. "I choose myself," he said simply. "These boys have lives ahead of them and people who'll miss them. I'm making this decision freely, without coercion from my friends." The entity's terrible gaze fixed upon Red with something that might have been respect. "Freely given is the sweetest offering," it said. "Your sacrifice honors the old compacts and will be remembered in the deep places where such things matter." The final moments of Red McConnell's life unfolded with a surreal dignity that would haunt Pierre Boudreau and Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau for the remainder of their days. As the swamp demon accepted his sacrifice, Red maintained the stoic composure that carried him through 4 decades of frontier life, refusing to allow fear or despair to diminish his final act of heroism. "Tell them I went down fighting," Red said to his companions, his voice steady despite the tremor in his weathered hands. "Don't let them think I just gave up and fed myself to some swamp monster. A man's reputation is about all that survives him, and I'd prefer mine to be worth something." The creature's method of claiming its prize proved to be mercifully swift, though the mechanism defied rational explanation. Red simply walked into the dark water at the entity's gesture, and as the surface closed over his head, he seemed to dissolve rather than drown, his physical form becoming part of the swamp itself in a transformation that was both horrifying and oddly peaceful. Pierre and Thibodeau watched in stunned silence as their friend disappeared into the depths, leaving behind only a few bubbles and the gradual return of normal sounds to the previously silent landscape. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued their camp for days began to lift almost immediately, as if Red's sacrifice had satisfied some cosmic debt and restored the natural balance to their section of the deep water. The swamp demon's final words to them carried both promise and warning. "The compact is fulfilled and safe passage is granted, but speak carefully of what you have witnessed here, for there are those who would seek to exploit such knowledge, and my patience with human ambition has limits that you would not wish to test." Their journey back to civilization became a nightmare of navigation through waterways that seemed to shift and change when they weren't looking directly at them. What should have been a familiar route became a labyrinthine puzzle that tested their sanity and survival skills to the breaking point. Several times they found themselves in channels they were certain they had never seen before, following compass bearings that should have led them home but instead brought them to dead ends or circular routes that returned them to their starting points. It was only when they abandoned their attempts at rational navigation and allowed Thibodeau's inherited instincts to guide them that they finally began to make progress toward the inhabited regions of the basin. His grandfather's teachings, dismissed by younger generations as primitive superstition, proved more reliable than modern instruments in a landscape where the normal rules of geography seemed to bend and flex according to the will of entities far older than human civilization. They emerged from the deep water on October 27th, 5 days after Red's sacrifice, their physical appearance so dramatically altered by their ordeal that their own families initially failed to recognize them. Both men had aged visibly during their time in the swamp's heart, their hair showing streaks of premature gray and their eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of soldiers who had witnessed too much combat. More disturbing still was their inability to provide a coherent account of what had happened to Red McConnell. Under questioning by local authorities, their stories contained inconsistencies and impossible elements that made them sound like the ravings of men driven mad by isolation and fear. Pierre's account emphasized the creature's supernatural abilities and otherworldly nature, while Thibodeau focused on the historical and cultural context that had prepared him to understand their encounter. The official report, filed by Sheriff Auguste Broussard of St. Martin Parish, attributed Red's disappearance to accidental drowning during routine trapping operations, with contributing factors including difficult terrain, adverse weather conditions, and the inherent dangers of working in remote wetland areas. The inconsistencies in survivors' testimonies were explained as the result of shock and exhaustion following a traumatic accident. But within the close-knit communities of the Louisiana swamplands, where ancient stories carried more weight than official reports, the true nature of their encounter was recognized and quietly acknowledged. Elder members of the Cajun families nodded knowingly when they heard certain details, while the indigenous peoples who still maintained connections to their ancestral traditions offered prayers and performed purification rituals designed to protect the survivors from any spiritual contamination they might have acquired during their time in the deep water. Pierre Boudreau never trapped again, abandoning his life in the swamps for steady work in New Orleans, where the presence of electric lights and crowded streets provided some measure of comfort against the memories that haunted his sleep. He married within 2 years and raised 4 children, but those closest to him noted that he never spoke of his time in the wetlands and would leave any room where swamp stories were being told. Thibodeau continued working the more accessible waterways for several more years, but he never again ventured into the remote areas where the old powers still held sway. His knowledge of the deep water secrets made him a sought-after guide for scientific expeditions and government surveys, though he carefully steered such groups away from the areas he knew to be dangerous. In his later years, Thibodeau became a repository of traditional knowledge, collecting and preserving the stories that earlier generations had carried in their memories. His interviews with ethnographers and folklorists provided valuable documentation of indigenous beliefs and Cajun folklore, though he was careful to frame the most dangerous information as legend rather than literal truth. The fate of Red McConnell remained officially unresolved, though local fishermen and moss gatherers reported occasional sightings of a figure that might have been him in the deepest parts of the Atchafalaya Basin. These accounts describe a man of Red's general appearance who seemed to exist in harmony with the swamp's ancient rhythms, serving as a guardian or a guide for the entities that dwelt in the dark water. Whether these sightings represented Red's spirit, his transformed physical form, or simply the wishful thinking of men who needed to believe that their friend had found some form of peace in his sacrifice, remained a matter of debate among those who had known him in life. The encounter between 3 Louisiana trappers and the ancient entity known as the swamp demon marked not an ending, but rather a continuation of patterns that had repeated themselves throughout the recorded history of the Atchafalaya Basin. In the decades following Red McConnell's sacrifice, investigators and researchers would uncover evidence suggesting that similar incidents had occurred with disturbing regularity across the centuries, each following broadly similar patterns of contact, negotiation, and terrible price. Dr. Marie Evangeline Trosclair, a folklorist from Tulane University who conducted extensive interviews with Pierre Boudreau in the 1920s, documented over 40 separate accounts of encounters with supernatural entities in Louisiana's wetlands dating back to the Spanish colonial period. Her research, published posthumously in 1934 as Spirits of the Deep Water, Supernatural Encounters in Louisiana Swamplands, reveal consistent details across testimonies separated by decades or even centuries. The most chilling aspect of Dr. Trosclair's findings was a mathematical precision with which these encounters seemed to occur. Every 20 to 30 years, usually during periods of unusual weather patterns or environmental stress, groups of men would venture into the deep water region and encounter something that challenged their understanding of reality. Some groups would return intact but forever changed. Others would suffer casualties that could never be adequately explained, and still others would vanish entirely, leaving behind only abandoned equipment and confused search parties. Archaeological evidence discovered during WPA projects in the 1930s seemed to support the supernatural accounts with disturbing physical proof. Construction workers building levees and drainage systems uncovered what appeared to be ritual sites dating back hundreds of years. Circular arrangements of cypress posts driven deep into the swamp floor, with carved symbols that matched descriptions found in early missionary reports and indigenous oral traditions. Most significant was the discovery of what researchers termed sacrifice pools, deep, perfectly circular depressions in the swamp floor that showed no signs of natural formation and seemed to possess unusual properties that defied scientific explanation. Water samples taken from these pools revealed chemical compositions that should have been impossible given the surrounding environment, with mineral contents that suggested contact with deep geological formations that lay miles beneath the swamp surface. The outbreak of World War II temporarily shifted scientific attention away from such esoteric research, but military activities in the region provided new opportunities for encounter documentation. Training exercises conducted in the Atchafalaya Basin generated classified reports of unusual incidents that would not be declassified until the 1970s, revealing that even hardened combat veterans had been affected by their experiences in the deep water regions. Captain James Morrison, commanding a Special Operations Training Unit in 1943, filed a report describing the complete psychological breakdown of an entire squad following a night navigation exercise that had taken them into areas that local guides had specifically warned against entering. The surviving soldiers required extensive psychiatric treatment and were quietly transferred to non-combat roles, their military records sealed to prevent their accounts from affecting unit morale. The post-war period brought renewed scientific interest in the region's anomalous properties, fueled partly by advances in recording technology that allowed researchers to document phenomena that had previously existed only in human testimony. Audio recordings made in the deep water areas captured sounds that acoustics experts found impossible to classify, vocalizations that seemed to combine elements of human speech with animal calls, and environmental sounds in ways that suggested neither natural occurrence nor deliberate human production. Dr. Robert Chenault of LSU's biology department spent 3 decades studying the ecological anomalies of the Atchafalaya Basin, publishing over 50 peer-reviewed papers on what he termed localized environmental irregularities. His work documented areas where normal biological processes seemed to be suspended or altered, zones where decomposition rates were dramatically slowed, where electromagnetic instruments malfunctioned without apparent cause, and where wildlife populations show behavioral patterns that had no analog in standard zoological literature. Chenault's final paper, published shortly before his retirement in 1978, exactly 100 years after the Thibodeau expedition, presented a theoretical framework that attempted to reconcile scientific methodology with the accumulated testimony of supernatural encounters. His hypothesis suggested that certain geographical locations might serve as intersection points between different layers of reality, places where the normal constraints of physical law became permeable and allowed for phenomena that appeared supernatural but might actually represent interactions with aspects of existence that human science had not yet learned to measure or understand. The centennial anniversary of Red McConnell's sacrifice brought renewed attention to the case, with historians and paranormal investigators mounting several expeditions designed to locate the exact site of the encounter and potentially document similar phenomena. None of these modern attempts succeeded in making contact with the swamp demon, though several groups reported experiences that echoed elements of the original testimony: unexplained sounds, equipment malfunctions, and a persistent sensation of being observed by invisible watchers. Pierre Boudreau died in 1934, taking with him the most detailed first-hand account of the encounter. His death was preceded by several weeks of fevered rambling about returning to the deep water to settle accounts, and make sure Red is still keeping his end of the bargain. Family members who attended his deathbed reported that his final words were spoken in a language none of them recognized, though linguistic experts who analyzed phonetic transcriptions suggested similarities to reconstructed Proto-Attakapas dialects that had been extinct for over a century. Thibodeau lived until 1951, serving as a bridge between the old traditions and the modern world's attempts to understand the supernatural heritage of Louisiana's wetlands. His extensive interviews and written accounts provided the foundation for most subsequent research into the region's anomalous properties, though he consistently refused to reveal the exact location of their 1878 encounter, claiming that such knowledge was too dangerous for modern men who've forgotten how to show proper respect. Contemporary investigators continue to search for evidence of the swamp demon's existence, using sophisticated equipment and scientific methodologies that would have been unimaginable to the trappers of 1878. Yet despite advances in technology and understanding, the essential mystery remains unsolved, a testament to the possibility that some aspect of reality may forever lie beyond the reach of human comprehension. The legacy of that terrifying October night continues to influence the culture and consciousness of Louisiana's swampland communities, where children still learn to avoid certain waterways after dark, and where old men speak in whispers of bargains that should never be made and prices that can never truly be paid in full. In the deep water, where cypress shadows dance on surfaces that reflect more than sky and cloud, something ancient continues its patient vigil, waiting for the next group of humans bold enough or foolish enough to venture into territory that has never truly belonged to mortal men. And in the twisted roots of trees older than recorded history, the spirit of Red McConnell perhaps still stands guard, a sentinel protecting the living from truths too terrible for civilized minds to bear. The marsh remembers all who enter its domain, and it never forgets the debts that must eventually be paid.